Battle of New Orleans was the last time America was invaded by a foreign power, and it basically cemented America's control over North America. Canada to the north has too few people, and Mexico has too many internal strifes, and everywhere else is too small to compete. So the question that's asked is, what if the U.S. lost the Battle of New Orleans? If you've never heard of the Battle of New Orleans, the Battle of New Orleans was a battle in 1850 between the U.S. and Britain when the British landed an army in southern Louisiana planning on taking the city of New Orleans. But the Tennessee militia, led by Andrew Jackson, fought them off and prevented the British from seizing Louisiana. The reason the British lost the battle was because they underestimated the American army. The Americans had fortified a landing spot at Chalmette, and when the British landed at Chalmette, the only way they could have fought their way through is a direct charge across an open field against Andrew Jackson's earthworks. But what they should have done would be that they should have gotten back on their boats and sailed and landed at a different spot where they wouldn't have to charge direct earthworks. Doing this would have meant that the large British army could have been able to seize New Orleans and defeat Andrew Jackson's army. Provided the British did this and defeated Andrew Jackson's army elsewhere, they would have seized Louisiana, and Louisiana would have become part of the British Empire. The British controlling the mouth of the Mississippi would greatly irk many Americans because so much of America is on the Mississippi watershed, meaning vast amounts of the Midwest would drain into the Mississippi, and so the British would control all trade coming in and out of the Midwest, and if they imposed high tariffs, no one could stop them, so U.S.-British relationships would sour quickly. The Pork and Bean War was a skirmish fought between the state of Maine and British Canada over logging rights on the what's now the New Brunswick-Maine border. And it got so close to being actually turning into a full-blown war that the U.S. marched 50,000 men led by Winfield Scott to the Canadian border. But in a world where the U.S. and Britain would hate each other's guts, the Pork and Bean Wars would easily erupt into a full-blown war between the U.S. and Britain. The main reason the U.S. lost the Canadian theater of the War of 1812 was because the American generals were terrible, but with Winfield Scott using 50,000 men, that would mean that the U.S. could easily have conquered Canada in 1839. Except for Halifax, which the Royal Navy would have been able to keep a hold on, as well as Newfoundland. Meanwhile, we can assume that the U.S. thrust into Louisiana would be led by Zachary Taylor, and it would be hard for Britain to supply enough troops to defend Louisiana, and Zachary Taylor is a pretty good general, meaning the U.S. would be able to conquer Louisiana in the 1830s. The British, because they would have naval superiority, would likely put Washington to the torch again, and the Americans, realizing that Washington would be too close to the coast, would likely move their capital further inland. They'd still have to keep their agreement with Virginia that the capital would be next to Virginia or in Virginia, and the best choice they could be Wheeling, West Virginia, because it's right on the Ohio and is fairly strategic, as well as being right on the Virginia-Pennsylvania border, and being far away from the coast. After the war, the English-speaking Canadians would fit into the U.S. fairly well, because English-speaking Canada is very close culturally to the U.S. Meanwhile, the Quebecois wouldn't fit in very well. The U.S. wasn't very nice to the Hispanics of New Mexico, so we can assume they wouldn't be very nice to the French of Quebec either, and so we'd assume the Quebecois would be oppressed. Free states didn't want the Trail of Tears to happen because it would mean that there would be more slave states. And so, the Trail of Tears bill was only passed by a very thin margin. But with Canada all being free states, that would mean that the Trail of Tears would never have happened in this timeline, and so there would still be large communities of Native Americans in the Southeast. The tribes that were sent on the Trail of Tears were called the 5 Civilized Tribes, because they were adapting to European culture, and they started to live in European-style houses, work on European-style farms, and wear European-style clothing. meaning that if they were not sent in the Trail of Tears, we can assume that the 5 civilized tribes would have melted into the American Southeast culture. These tribes likely be incorporated into American culture and become another minority, like the Catholics or the blacks, and they would likely keep part of their culture also, and the Southeast would have more Native American cultural influences. Because Canada would be free states, to create a balance between slave and free states, the U.S. would annex more of North Mexico in this timeline in the Mexican-American War. During the Civil War, with the U.S. fighting on the Union-Confederate border, the Quebecois would see this as a perfect time to rebel against U.S. authority. The British would think this would be a perfect time to split the U.S. in half and liberate Quebec to weaken the U.S. and prevent it from being an economic power that could threaten Britain on the global market. And so, Britain would declare war on the U.S. and ally with the C.S.A. and the Quebecois rebels. Those of you who have seen my What If the South Won the Civil War scenario are probably wondering, why doesn't France help the Confederates, and why doesn't that lead to a World War I scenario in the 1860s? And the reason is, France wouldn't want to, because in my What If the South Won the Civil War scenario, the Confederates seized Washington, thus proving that they were an upstart power that could take on the U.S. But France, without that, wouldn't know that the Confederates could take on the U.S., and so they wouldn't take the risk of helping the Confederates, and without France entering in the American War, the Germans and the Russians wouldn't feel worried that France was getting too powerful, and so they wouldn't join to help the USA. The British would land a force in Quebec to help the Quebecois against the American troops, as well as a force in North New Jersey to help wipe out New York and Philadelphia. The Crimean War showed that the British were terrible at amphibious landings on hostile terrain, and this added with the Americans could muster 100,000 men, while the British could only ferry about 15,000 across the Atlantic, would mean that both of these spearheads would fail, and the Quebecois rebels be crushed. But both of these strikes would move troops away from the war with the Confederates, and the British would be ferrying guns and cannons and ammunition to the Confederates, meaning in the end the Confederacy would win the Civil War. To be continued. See what happens next in What If the U.S. Lost the Battle of New Orleans Part 2. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. Whatifalthist. Thank you.